Okay, everyone, I wanted to go over the PowerPoint to argue or not to argue, which is just a basic overview of different types of argumentation. This is a PowerPoint that I used to use for my previous English 103 classes that was based on a textbook called Everything's an Argument. So it was pretty specific to that textbook, but I thought it was useful to introducing different types of arguments for our class, even though we're going to be looking at humor as argument, as a form of argument. Okay, but I'd like to go over some of these slides really quick. Okay. All right. Why argue? Right. Some of us probably don't like to argue. You may be a person who doesn't like to argue, but some would argue, ironically enough, that almost everything we do in some way or another is a type of argument. We might think of it as argument is not necessarily something that's adversarial, confrontational, but just a way to convince people, right, to believe what we believe, to take an action that we think is a good action, is an effective action, or to just get people to feel what we feel. Okay, that's really what we do with arguments. It's a type of persuasion. And as I mentioned down here, the art of persuasion is known as rhetoric. Okay, and arguments are an element of rhetoric. Okay, rhetoric, it just means the way that we use words. Doesn't have to be words, right? It could also be gestures, right? It could also be works of art, right? It could be anything that we use, right, to motivate people to do what we want, right, or to feel what we feel. Okay. Again, not arguments have to be adversarial, right? Sometimes some arguments are exploratory, some are about building consensus, right? Some are even proposals, solutions to a problem, okay? But we have to convince people to take up this solution, okay? All right, anything can be an argument, even the way that you dress. When you get up in the morning and you make decisions about clothes that you wear, that's an argument. And basically, that argument says, this is how I would like you to see me. This is who I am. Okay. Even something like wearing a sports team, your favorite sports team's, gear, or a baseball hat or something, would also signal a certain type of way you want people to see you. Okay. All right. What is the goal of argumentation? To convince people, obviously, and to persuade people. Okay. To convince means, okay, first I have to convince you that what I say is correct. Okay. I put enough strong evidence, right? I had a strong premise, a strong conclusion, and I've convinced you that what I say is correct. The next thing is to persuade you. Okay. Now that I've proven to you that I'm correct. Now, what are you going to do about it? So it's moving people to action. Okay. So in order to persuade people, we need to convince. Okay. All right. Other goals of argumentation: to deliberate, right? To make a decision. For example, should we move to a 16-week calendar? Right? Should we? Right now, there are some fierce deliberations going on about whether or not we should open up in the spring, right? People put forth arguments, other people put forth counter arguments. And the real goal of argumentation is that the good and strong arguments prevail, okay? And that's what we're going to look at eventually. What makes a good and strong argument? What makes one argument better than another? One of the common fallacies out in the world today is that just because there are two positions on a topic means that both arguments are equally valid. Both arguments are strong, and that's not the case. When the goal of argumentation is that one argument prevail, and that was also in Rebecca Newberger Goldstein and Steven Pinker's TED video. Okay, that good arguments not only prevail, not only convince and persuade, right, but they travel well. Okay, and they're used in different contexts for different topics, especially if the structure of the argument is sound. Did the arguer have a strong premise? Did the argument also reach a strong conclusion? Okay, all right, but that's all you need to know about arguments. Okay. All right. All right. There are different types of arguments, right? There are different occasions to argue. Sometimes we argue about the past. When we argue about the past, right, these are forensic arguments. And I gave you a lot of examples on this slide, and they're somewhat dated, but you can think of, the current debate about tearing down statues Confederate statues that pay tribute to, um, you know, um, soldiers in the Confederacy or generals in the Confederacy, and there's a debate, a debate about this, and arguments made. Right, and these are forensic arguments. How should we think of the past? And really, when you think about it, the arguments about the past are really about what we value in the present. Okay. All right, and then there are arguments about the future. Okay, what do we do? I mean, should we open the college for the spring semester? That's really an argument about the future. Okay, who should we pick to be on the Supreme Court? Those are arguments about the future. Those are lifetime appointments. Okay. All right. And there are arguments about the present. These are events that pop up that people take different sides or positions on. Okay. And you can see the examples here, which are pretty self explanatory. All right. So, you can take this little quiz again. Arguments of the past are called what? Forensic arguments. Arguments of the present are called deliberative. And arguments of the future arguments of the present are called epideictic. And arguments of the future are called deliberative. I'm sorry, I messed that up a little bit. Okay. So those are occasions to argue. We argue about the past, the present, the future, but there are also different types of arguments, right? There's arguments of fact. Did something happen, right? What is the nature of the thing that happened? What is the quality of its cause, right? What that means is, that third thing on this slide, arguments of evaluation. Those are some of the most common arguments. Like, what's the greatest horror film ever made, right? That's an argument of evaluation. Who's the better director, Jordan Peele or Spike Lee, right? And then there are proposal arguments. Okay. Again, should we build another parking lot at Cerritos in order to accommodate overcrowded parking, right? Those are deliberative arguments, but those are arguments about what kind of action should be taken, okay? Arguments of fact, did something happen, right? You look at statistics and say, what does this statistic say? What should we do about it? There's arguments of definition, right? For example, an argument of definition. Is the word ghetto inherently racist, for example? What does cancel culture really mean? Is it dangerous as its critics contend? Things like that. Okay, I'm going to skip that slide. The next thing I want to talk about really briefly, because I don't want to make this too long, is the three rhetorical appeals, which you might have heard of. Most students were introduced to the rhetorical appeals in high school. And we're going to watch a short little animated TED video that will explain it much better than I will. Ethos, right? All you have to think of ethos is the authority of the speaker, right? Our audience is willing to listen to the speaker and trust them. What are they known for? What is their credibility? Pathos is the way you appeal to an audience's emotions. Can you make the audience feel a certain emotion, but not by manipulating them? You can't go up and make a speech and start crying and, make the audience feel sorry for you, because in most cases it will backfire. But how can you, through your choice of style and delivery and the words that you use, right, invoke an emotional reaction? And it could be any emotion. It can be sadness, it could be anger, it could be joy. Logos, and that's the appeal to reason, support, and evidence, right? How strong is the evidence that you put forward? How logical are your claims, right? This is important, but it's not the most important. Remember, there's, according to Aristotle, ethos, pathos, and logos, there needs to be, depending on the audience, right, an appropriate level of all three of these to make a successful argument, a successful rhetorical appeal to an audience, okay? For example, a lot of speakers who rely almost exclusively on logic but neglect something like pathos or even ethos, right, will sometimes not be as convincing. For example, scientists have this problem, right? Sometimes scientists speak over our head and they lack a certain pathos, right? And that's this idea that they can really connect with the audience, that eventually their ethos starts to wane, right? And whatever they say, even if it's firmly rooted in logic and evidence, is not as persuasive as opposed to a speaker who's able to use all three of these. There's another. It's not a rhetorical appeal, but it's something that Aristotle had mentioned that you should pay special attention to, and that's the idea of kairos. Kairos. And kairos really means timeliness. It's saying the right thing at the right time. How many times have we encountered people who may have maybe excellent speakers, may have, strong sense of ethos, pathos, and logos, but they're making their argument at a time when people aren't open to hear their argument. I'll give you an example of this. The Parkland shooting in Florida, the student, I can't remember her name, Emma Gonzalez, I think it was. She gives a speech a couple of days after the shooting, and though the speech isn't firmly rooted in logos, for example, she doesn't throw a lot of statistics. What she's able to do is really appeal to the audience's emotion, both anger and sadness, to really push for gun control. And although on paper her speech might not have been a solid argument, it was the perfect speech at the right time. And that's what Kairos is all about. Okay? All right. And that's the end of that. So hopefully that made that PowerPoint a little bit clearer. Okay? Thank you.